Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of betrayal, deception, and a deadly obsession. This is the story of Whitey Bulger, the notorious mobster who led a double life in the criminal underworld. A tale of power, corruption, and lies that would take decades to unravel. Stay with us as we unravel the dark and tragic story of Whitey Bulger, his rise to power, his hidden life, and the shocking secrets that no one could have seen coming. Whitey Bulger was more than just a mob boss. He was a master manipulator, a double agent, and a ruthless criminal who played both sides of the law. But how did he rise to power, evade justice for decades, and ultimately become one of the most wanted men in America? And what shocking betrayals led to his dramatic downfall? This is the untold story of Whitey Bulger's double life of crime and deception. Whitey Bulger's story begins in the gritty, working-class neighborhoods of South Boston, where he was born in 1929. The city was a melting pot of poverty, hard work, and crime, a backdrop that would shape his character and destiny. Growing up in a time of great hardship, Whitey learned early on that the streets weren't kind to those who didn't fight for themselves. The son of Irish immigrants, he was raised in a family that struggled to make ends meet, and the atmosphere in the city only fueled his need to survive. South Boston, or Southie as locals called it, was a rough and dangerous place in the 1940s. Street gangs and criminal syndicates ruled the underworld, with violence and extortion commonplace. Whitey's early life was marked by small-time hustle, stealing, gambling, and petty theft. He was caught in the cycle of crime and punishment, arrested numerous times in his youth for minor offenses. But even at this early stage, Whitey exhibited a ruthless streak, a characteristic that would define his future as a criminal mastermind. By his 20s, Whitey had grown restless with the idea of just scraping by. He had big ambitions, and the criminal world offered the quickest path to wealth and power. His natural charisma and street smarts caught the attention of local figures involved in organized crime. In the early 1950s, Whitey connected with Buddy McLean, the leader of the Winter Hill Gang, a notorious Irish-American crime syndicate that controlled much of the criminal activity in the Boston area. The Winter Hill Gang was entrenched in illegal activities like extortion, racketeering, loan sharking, and more. They were the backbone of organized crime in South Boston, and their reach stretched far beyond the city limits. Whitey quickly climbed the ranks within the Winter Hill Gang. His ambition, cunning, and knack for manipulation made him a valuable asset. But his loyalty was always to himself. He wasn't content simply being a soldier in the gang, he wanted to control it. He was clever enough to know that in this world, power didn't come from simply taking orders, it came from making deals and playing both sides. It was around this time that Whitey made a decision that would change his life forever. Behind closed doors, he entered into an agreement that no one would have suspected. He became an informant for the FBI. The arrangement was simple. Whitey would give the FBI information on the activities of rival criminal organizations, particularly the Italian Mafia, which controlled parts of New England's criminal enterprises. The FBI, always eager to take down the powerful Mafia families, welcomed Whitey's insider knowledge. But Whitey wasn't driven by patriotism or a desire to help the government. He had a far more personal motive. By becoming an informant, Whitey gained leverage over his rivals and law enforcement alike. He could tip off the FBI about his competition's activities while simultaneously building his own empire. His double life began, and he was able to navigate the criminal world with impunity. His relationship with the FBI remained secret, and his growing power within the Winter Hill Gang went unnoticed by those around him. The more information he fed to the FBI, the more power he gained over his enemies, but also over the very people who thought they could trust him. As Whitey's influence within the Winter Hill Gang grew, so did his ruthlessness. He was involved in more violent acts, including extortion and murder. His ambition led him to believe that nothing and no one could stand in his way. He didn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened his status within the organization. Whether it was business partners who had outlived their usefulness or rivals who were getting too close to his territory, Whitey's method was always the same: silence them before they could become a problem. However, what most people didn't realize was that Whitey wasn't just eliminating his enemies, he was simultaneously building an empire of fear and deception. He knew how to manipulate people, make them feel safe and secure, only to betray them at the first sign of weakness. His double life allowed him to walk through both the underworld and the world of law enforcement without suspicion. To the public, he was just another gangster, another dangerous man lurking in the shadows of South Boston. But to the FBI, he was a valuable informant, a source of critical intelligence that could cripple their enemies. But there were cracks in Whitey's carefully constructed world. As his power grew, so did his paranoia. He trusted no one, not even his closest associates. The more ambitious he became, the more he feared betrayal. He would often eliminate those who were loyal to him simply to maintain control. He couldn't afford to let anyone get too close, for fear they might discover his true intentions. In Whitey's mind, loyalty was a fleeting concept, something to be bought, not earned. Despite the violence and secrecy, Whitey continued to build his empire. But as the 1960s came to a close, tensions within the Winter Hill Gang began to rise. Whitey had made more than a few enemies, both inside and outside his own organization. The Italian Mafia, led by the Patriarca family, had long been the dominant force in the region's criminal activities. But Whitey's rise was disrupting that balance, and it wouldn't be long before a dangerous conflict erupted. As the gang war between the Winter Hill Gang and the Italian Mafia escalated, Whitey was forced to walk a fine line. He had his eyes on the prize, complete control of South Boston's criminal operations, but his growing ambition would soon put him in the crosshairs of even more powerful enemies. And with the FBI still unaware of his true motives, Whitey continued to weave a web of deception that would keep the authorities off his trail for years. The first real cracks in Whitey's world were beginning to show, and the stakes were higher than ever. No one, not even Whitey himself, knew how much longer he could keep up the facade of being both a feared gangster and a trusted informant. As the battle for power raged on, Whitey's true nature and the dangerous game he was playing was about to be exposed in ways that no one could have predicted. As Whitey Bulger's influence within the Winter Hill Gang expanded, so did his ability to manipulate both his criminal associates and the FBI. His role as an informant for the government became a key element of his power, but it was also his greatest secret, one that would set the stage for his eventual downfall. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Whitey's position within South Boston's underworld was becoming more solidified. His connection to the FBI remained under the radar, a relationship that allowed him to outsmart rival gangs and stay ahead of law enforcement while continuing to grow his empire. The Winter Hill Gang, under his influence, became more dangerous and efficient. The Mafia, particularly the Patriarca family, had long controlled much of New England's criminal activities, and Whitey's rise to power began to rattle their control. Yet, it was not just the Mafia he had to contend with, it was also the law. While Whitey's name was whispered on the streets, few could make a direct connection between him and the crimes plaguing South Boston. He had mastered the art of operating in the shadows, making calculated moves to avoid capture. With the FBI in his back pocket, Whitey was playing a double game, acting as both a criminal mastermind and a trusted informant. This gave him a unique position of power, as he could monitor the law's moves, tipping off the authorities when it suited him while feeding them just enough information to maintain his standing as a valuable informant. At the same time, Whitey's ability to eliminate rivals, whether they were from his own organization or from the Mafia, became central to his method of control. He had no qualms about resorting to violence to maintain his authority. The Winter Hill Gang, under Whitey's leadership, became synonymous with ruthless efficiency. If someone posed a threat, they vanished. This was a time when corruption within law enforcement was rampant, and the FBI, under the influence of Whitey's network, became blind to his true intentions. The agent assigned to handle Whitey, John Connolly, was particularly taken in by the mobster's charm and cunning. Connolly, a former Boston police officer who had risen within the FBI, saw White not only as a source of valuable intelligence, but as a man he could trust. He overlooked Whitey's violent tendencies and saw him as a partner in the fight against the Mafia. This partnership, however, would prove to be one of the greatest betrayals in the history of American law enforcement. While the FBI remained convinced that Whitey was feeding them critical information on rival criminal organizations, Whitey was secretly using this relationship to eliminate those who stood in his way. He had become the eyes and ears within the law enforcement community, giving him an unprecedented advantage. He wasn't just informing on the Mafia, he was helping to weaken them while consolidating his own power. Behind closed doors, Whitey would eliminate anyone he deemed a threat, silencing those who might expose him or challenge his growing empire. Despite his ability to stay ahead of law enforcement and rival gangs, Whitey's personal life began to complicate matters. He had a family to consider, including his brother, Whitey Bulger, a powerful political figure who served as the president of the Massachusetts State Senate. To the public, Billy was a respected politician, a man of integrity, yet behind the scenes he was closely connected to his brother's criminal activities. While Billy had his own career and public persona, he was aware of Whitey's criminal empire and seemed to turn a blind eye to the darker side of his brother's life. The connection between Whitey and Billy would play a significant role in the corruption and cover-ups that allowed Whitey to operate with near impunity for so many years. This web of influence, Whitey's connections to the FBI, his violent control over the Winter Hill Gang, and his brother's political sway created a dangerous cocktail of power that no one seemed able to dismantle. In public, Whitey was careful to maintain a low profile. He was no longer just a petty thief or small-time hustler. He had become a powerful figure in organized crime, commanding respect and fear wherever he went. But beneath the surface, Whitey's paranoia was growing. The more powerful he became, the more he feared betrayal. He didn't trust anyone, not even those closest to him. His growing obsession with control led him to betray allies who had once been loyal to him. Those who might have posed a challenge to his dominance were quietly disposed of, their disappearances often written off as unsolved mysteries. Despite the violence and manipulation that defined his rise to power, Whitey never lost sight of the fact that he was a businessman at heart. His criminal activities were well organized and highly profitable. Extortion, drug trafficking, loan sharking, and racketeering became the foundation of his operation. But he also had a knack for finding lucrative opportunities that others overlooked. Whether it was through drug deals or controlling illicit gambling rings, Whitey was always looking for the next way to expand his wealth and influence. However, as the 1970s approached, tensions within the Winter Hill Gang began to escalate. Whitey had eliminated some of his closest allies, fearing they might turn on him. But this left him vulnerable. His growing paranoia and the sense of betrayal that surrounded him began to take its toll. The Mafia, still a powerful force in the region, was not going to let Whitey's rise go unchallenged. At the same time, the FBI began to grow suspicious of his activities. They had seen too many of their own agents become compromised by criminals in the past, and Whitey's cozy relationship with law enforcement was beginning to look more suspicious by the day. The cracks in Whitey's empire were starting to show, but he wasn't ready to fall just yet. He had successfully manipulated law enforcement for years, but as the criminal world around him began to shift, he would soon have to confront the fact that the very systems he had used to protect himself were beginning to close in. The next phase of his criminal life would be marked by even greater betrayal, deeper corruption, and a rise in violence that would leave the streets of Boston stained with blood. Whitey's double life was becoming harder to maintain, but with his control over the Winter Hill Gang firmly in place and the FBI still in his corner, he was determined to stay on top no matter what it took. As he looked ahead, he could already see the next chapter of his criminal reign unfolding, though he was unaware of the twists that would eventually lead to his fall. By the time the 1970s arrived, Whitey Bulger had become a fixture in South Boston's criminal landscape. But with this dominance came a new set of challenges. The Winter Hill Gang, once a small-time operation, had evolved under Whitey's leadership into a force to be reckoned with. However, Whitey wasn't just focused on expanding his empire within South Boston. He had set his sights on something larger, a confrontation with the Italian Mafia, whose stronghold over New England's criminal activities had long been uncontested. This war was brewing, and Whitey, ever ambitious, was ready to escalate the violence to secure his dominance. The Patriarca family, led by Raymond Patriarca, was the primary target of Whitey's operations. For years, the Mafia had controlled much of the region's illicit enterprises' protection rackets, illegal gambling, drug trafficking, and more. Whitey, feeling that his own territory and business ventures were being encroached upon, began to plot how he could take down his most powerful rival. The battle for power would quickly evolve from a business rivalry into a brutal, violent war that shook the criminal underworld. Whitey's decision to engage in a war with the Mafia wasn't one made lightly. He understood the stakes. The Mafia was not just powerful, but entrenched. Their reach extended across multiple states, and their connections ran deep. But Whitey had something the Mafia didn't need: inside information, strategic alliances, and the protection of the FBI. As an informant, he had access to intelligence that allowed him to stay one step ahead of the law and his enemies. Whitey played both sides of the fence with remarkable skill. While feeding the FBI information about the Mafia, he was simultaneously building a network of alliances with key players in Boston's criminal circles, some of whom would eventually be turned into his enemies. The violence that erupted between the Winter Hill Gang and the Patriarca family was as ruthless as it was inevitable. White's tactics were simple yet effective: eliminate the leaders of the Mafia, destabilize their operations, and absorb their businesses into his own empire. He was no stranger to murder, and as the killings mounted, the fear of Whitey's rise spread throughout the criminal community. But the violence wasn't just confined to the streets of Boston. Whitey's influence reached far beyond the city, and as the conflict escalated, so did the risks. The FBI, still unaware of the full extent of Whitey's double life, continued to rely on him for information. His reports on the Mafia were detailed, accurate, and often led to arrests of key Mafia figures. But while the law enforcement community believed they were gaining ground against the Mafia, Whitey was playing a far more dangerous game. As he fed the FBI intelligence, he was also using it to weaken the Mafia's position, taking out key members of the organization and leaving them scrambling to maintain control. The Winter Hill Gang, once a loose coalition of small-time criminals, had transformed into a well-oiled operation under Whitey's leadership. But this didn't come without consequences. As Whitey's power grew, so did the number of enemies he made, both within his own ranks and beyond. He eliminated anyone he thought might be a threat to his position, betraying even those closest to him. In a world where loyalty was currency, Whitey's idea of loyalty was one-sided, and betrayal was part of the game. His ruthlessness, which had once been an asset, was now beginning to catch up with him. But Whitey's paranoia was his greatest weapon. He had a finely tuned sense of who might turn on him and acted quickly to eliminate them. His cold, calculating nature meant that no one was safe from his wrath. As the bodies began to pile up, many in South Boston began to whisper about Whitey's growing brutality. Yet, despite the mounting suspicion, the FBI remained convinced of Whitey's usefulness. His connections to law enforcement gave him a level of protection that was almost untouchable. His status as an informant had afforded him special treatment, and with the agency's trust, he could continue to operate in the shadows, manipulating both sides to his advantage. But while Whitey was busy dealing with the Mafia, his personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. His brother, Billy Bulger, was a rising political star. As the president of the Massachusetts State Senate, Billy was one of the most powerful figures in the state. On the surface, Billy appeared to be the picture of respectability. He was well-spoken, well-liked, and appeared to be completely removed from the criminal world. But beneath the polished image, Billy was deeply intertwined with his brother's criminal activities. While he publicly distanced himself from Whitey's world, Billy was well aware of his brother's role in the criminal underworld. The connection between the two brothers was a tightly kept secret, one that would be difficult for anyone to uncover. But Whitey's rise to power would eventually bring that secret into the light. As the violence between the Winter Hill Gang and the Mafia intensified, Whitey began to feel the pressure mounting. His empire was growing, but so were the risks. The more people he eliminated, the more enemies he made. Yet, despite the danger surrounding him, Whitey's grip on power seemed unshakable. He had grown accustomed to being in control, and the idea of losing that control was something he couldn't fathom. However, even the most powerful figures can be brought down. As the war with the Mafia dragged on, Whitey's relationship with the FBI began to show cracks. The agency's growing concerns about his ties to organized crime were beginning to surface. They had already come close to uncovering his true nature, but Whitey's ability to outsmart them had kept him one step ahead. In the years that followed, Whitey's grip on South Boston tightened, but so did the scrutiny on him from both law enforcement and rival criminal organizations. The battle for control of New England's criminal landscape was far from over. As Whitey fought to maintain his dominance, the walls around him slowly began to close in. What he didn't know was that his double life, his alliance with the FBI, and his role in the Mafia war was about to implode, setting the stage for his eventual fall. The true scale of Whitey's crimes would soon come to light, and with it, the dark secrets he had worked so hard to protect. As the 1980s dawned, Whitey Bulger's power seemed unstoppable. His grip on the criminal underworld in Boston was tighter than ever, and his double life acting as both a feared mob boss and an informant for the FBI continued to shield him from the authorities. The Winter Hill Gang was thriving, and Whitey's influence was felt not just in South Boston, but across New England. Yet beneath the surface of this growing empire, the cracks were beginning to show. Whitey's paranoia had reached new heights, and he became increasingly unpredictable, eliminating anyone he suspected of betraying him. His ruthless actions didn't just target rivals, even his closest allies were at risk if they crossed him. White's reign of terror wasn't without consequence. As his power grew, so did the intensity of the war with the Italian Mafia. While Whitey had dealt significant blows to the Patriarca family, the Mafia wasn't about to let a gangster like White take their place without a fight. The violence between the two groups had left a trail of bloodshed that shook Boston's criminal underworld. Yet Whitey, ever the tactician, continued to outmaneuver his enemies, taking control of more territory, while also ensuring that the FBI remained in his corner. His relationship with the Bureau had always been one of convenience, but now it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the illusion that Whitey was a loyal informant. Behind closed doors, Whitey was also facing pressure from within his own organization. As the head of the Winter Hill Gang, his leadership style was brutal, but that brutality had begun to alienate some of his closest members. The gang was built on loyalty, but Whitey's growing ruthlessness was pushing even his most trusted men to question his judgment. Some began to fear that Whitey's ambition had clouded his judgment. He no longer just wanted power, he wanted to control everything. The Winter Hill Gang had gone from a tight-knit operation to a network of terrified men, each one afraid that the slightest misstep could lead to their own demise. Whitey's paranoia reached such extremes that even his most loyal associates were becoming expendable. At the same time, the FBI's investigation into organized crime was beginning to heat up. The Bureau had its sights set on the Patriarca family, and Whitey's name kept surfacing in their reports. His connection to the Mafia, along with his role as an informant, made him a prime target, but Whitey's manipulation of law enforcement continued to shield him from real scrutiny. His FBI contact, John Connolly, remained his closest ally within the Bureau. Connolly, blinded by his loyalty to Whitey, continued to protect him, ensuring that any investigation into Whitey's activities was shut down or deflected. This mutual trust between Whitey and Connolly became the cornerstone of Whitey's ability to stay free from prosecution. However, Whitey's world was about to collapse in ways he hadn't anticipated. The very system that had protected him, the FBI, was beginning to unravel. As the 1980s progressed, new leadership within the Bureau began to question the effectiveness of the informant program. Whitey's name was becoming too toxic to ignore, and whispers about his true role in organized crime began to circulate among law enforcement officers who were growing increasingly suspicious of his activities. But it wasn't just law enforcement that was closing in on him. Whitey's criminal empire was also starting to show signs of decay. Despite his success in eliminating rivals and expanding his territory, Whitey's violent actions were beginning to take a toll. The body count continued to rise, and the streets of Boston were filled with rumors of his brutality. He had turned the Winter Hill Gang into a feared and respected organization, but the fear was not just directed outward, it was directed inward as well. Whitey's reign had made enemies, and not just in the Mafia. His former allies, those who had helped him build his empire, were beginning to turn on him. The FBI, once in his pocket, was beginning to question his loyalty, while those who had once looked up to him were starting to wonder if it was worth continuing to follow a man so consumed by paranoia and bloodlust. The pressure on Whitey reached a breaking point in 1986. The federal government had begun a massive crackdown on organized crime, targeting mafia families across the country. In Boston, the FBI was finally starting to take a closer look at the Winter Hill Gang, and they had begun to piece together a picture of Whitey's activities. The Bureau was aware of the long-standing ties between Whitey and the FBI, but they had no idea just how deep the corruption ran. They also knew that Whitey was more than just a local gangster. He had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the criminal justice system, a man who had manipulated the law to serve his own ends. As the investigation into Whitey's activities intensified, the cracks within his empire grew wider. One by one, members of the Winter Hill Gang began to cooperate with authorities, breaking the silence that had kept Whitey's empire intact for so long. These former associates had become disillusioned with Whitey's violent methods, and in some cases feared for their own lives. They began to share information with the FBI about the scope of Whitey's operations and his ties to organized crime. Whitey's betrayal of those closest to him had finally come back to haunt him. The very men he had used and discarded were now providing law enforcement with the evidence needed to bring him down. But even as the walls began to close in on him, Whitey continued to believe that he was invincible. His ego had grown so inflated that he couldn't fathom the idea of being caught. The thought that the FBI might turn on him never crossed his mind. He continued to rely on his informant status, convinced that the Bureau would protect him no matter what. But the truth was that Whitey had outlived his usefulness to the FBI. The agency had moved on to other priorities, and Whitey was now a liability. His connection to the Bureau was no longer enough to keep him safe. The final days of Whitey Bulger's reign were filled with desperation and betrayal. As law enforcement closed in, he made plans to go on the run. He had always managed to stay one step ahead of the law, but now, even his vast network of informants and allies couldn't shield him from the inevitable. Whitey would soon learn that the very power he had so carefully cultivated had become his downfall. His double life, once the key to his success, would now be the thing that led to his undoing. The FBI's betrayal of their former informant was just the beginning of a new chapter in Whitey's life, a chapter that would end in his capture, years later, far from the streets he once ruled. But before that, the criminal empire he had built would crumble, and the lies he had so carefully crafted would be exposed for the world to see. The fall of Whitey Bulger was as dramatic as his rise. After decades of aiding law enforcement, betraying his closest allies, and manipulating the very system that was supposed to bring him to justice, the unthinkable finally happened. Whitey's empire came crashing down. The tension had been building for years, and now the once untouchable figure was on the verge of being exposed. The collapse of his world was set into motion when the authorities, armed with testimony from former gang members and new investigative leads, began to piece together the full extent of Whitey's crimes. In the early 1990s, Whitey's empire was in jeopardy, but it wasn't the FBI or the Mafia that would ultimately bring him down. It was a betrayal from within his own ranks. As law enforcement intensified its investigation, more and more members of the Winter Hill Gang began cooperating with the authorities. These were the same men who had once feared Whitey's wrath, who had been complicit in his crimes, but who now realized that their loyalty had only ensured their own destruction. Some feared for their lives, others saw an opportunity for leniency in exchange for their cooperation. Slowly but surely, the FBI began to uncover the full scope of Whitey's operations: his murder spree, his racketeering, his drug trafficking, and the countless other crimes he had masterminded. The information flowed in from all directions, and the walls began to close in on Whitey. The breaking point came when former associates who had once been part of his inner circle began to turn on him. These men knew Whitey's secrets better than anyone. They knew about his ties to the FBI, his ruthlessness in eliminating rivals, and his ability to manipulate law enforcement for his own gain. As their testimonies began to add up, the case against Whitey became overwhelming. The final blow came when the FBI realized that not only had White been a criminal mastermind, but he had also been a double agent for the Bureau, feeding them false information and using his informant status to protect his own interests. It became clear that Whitey's manipulation of law enforcement had gone unchecked for too long. The relationship between him and Agent John Connolly, in particular, was under intense scrutiny. Connolly had been one of Whitey's closest allies within the Bureau, but as the investigation into Whitey's crimes deepened, it became clear that Connolly had been compromised. The agent had turned a blind eye to Whitey's criminal activities, allowing him to continue his reign of terror without interference. But as the pieces fell into place, both Whitey and Connolly were exposed for the web of lies they had spun over the years. Connolly's actions, which had once been seen as a valuable partnership, were now viewed as a severe betrayal of the law. As the FBI prepared to arrest Whitey, he had already slipped through their fingers once again. Aided by a network of loyalists and informants, Whitey had gone into hiding. His ability to disappear had become one of his most remarkable skills, but this time the authorities were determined not to let him slip away. Whitey's time on the run was marked by constant paranoia and fear. He had lived a life in which no one was to be trusted, but now even his closest allies could no longer be counted on. He had betrayed everyone who had ever helped him, and in return he was now a hunted man. For years, Whitey lived in hiding, moving from place to place under assumed identities, but his fall from grace was inevitable. His betrayal of the FBI, his ruthless murder spree, and the bloodshed that followed had left a trail of devastation that couldn't be ignored. As the investigation continued, more clues began to surface, and soon, Whitey's location was uncovered. It wasn't long before a federal task force, determined to finally bring him to justice, closed in on his hideout. In 2011, after more than 16 years of evading capture, Whitey Bulger was found. He had been living under an alias in Santa Monica, California, in a modest apartment with his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. The once feared mob boss was now a shadow of the man who had ruled over Boston's criminal world. He was arrested in the dead of night, and the man who had evaded justice for so long was finally in custody. The arrest was a culmination of years of investigation and a testament to the perseverance of law enforcement. Whitey's capture sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld and the FBI. His case became a symbol of how corruption can run deep within even the most trusted institutions. As he was brought back to Boston to stand trial, the full extent of his crimes was revealed to the public. The scale of his violence, his manipulation of law enforcement, and the trail of broken lives he had left behind were staggering. For years, Whitey had been a ghost, someone who seemed untouchable, someone whose power had shielded him from the consequences of his actions. But in the end, it was his own arrogance and the betrayals of those closest to him that led to his undoing. The trial of Whitey Bulger was a spectacle in its own right. The courtroom became a stage where the truth about his life and crimes was laid bare for all to see. The victims of his violent reign finally had a voice, and their stories were heard by the public. The long-awaited reckoning for Whitey was not just a victory for law enforcement, but for the countless individuals whose lives he had destroyed. His once feared reputation was tarnished beyond repair as the details of his double life were exposed. In 2013, Whitey Bulger was convicted of 11 murders, as well as a host of other crimes, including racketeering, extortion, and drug trafficking. His sentence was a lifetime behind bars. As he was led away from the courtroom, the man who had once ruled the streets of South Boston with an iron fist was now a prisoner, his reign of terror over. But the story didn't end there. Whitey's brother Billy Bulger, who had long denied any involvement in his brother's criminal activities, was also brought under scrutiny. The political figure, whose rise to power had been partially built on the Bulger name, faced increasing pressure to account for his ties to Whitey. Though Billy had never been directly involved in the criminal activities of his brother, his close relationship with Whitey and his apparent disregard for his brother's actions left many questioning his role in the family's web of corruption. Whitey's arrest marked the end of a long and violent chapter in Boston's history, but the legacy of his crimes would linger. His story was one of betrayal, manipulation, and the dangerous dance between crime and power. He had been a man who played both sides, law enforcement and the underworld, against each other, but in the end, it was the very system he had used to protect himself that brought him down. His capture served as a reminder that no one, not even the most powerful criminals, can outrun the truth forever. And that's the twisted and shocking story of Whitey Bulger, the mobster who lived a double life of crime, deception, and betrayal. A man who manipulated the system for decades, playing both sides to his advantage, only to have his empire crumble as the truth came to light. What do you think of Whitey's web of lies and his ultimate downfall? Was he simply a product of his environment, or did his own ambition push him to do unspeakable things? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dark and thrilling tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mystery Minds for more true crime stories. And as always, stay tuned for our next deep dive into the darkest corners of the criminal world.